5 12-year-old children went missing around this time a decade ago. They were only gone from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. before returning to their worried parents. None of them would talk about what happened to them that night. The police tried to get answers out of them, asking if they saw anyone out in the forest or if that person had hurt them in any way, but the children all remained silent. Their faces told the whole story though. 4 out of the 5 children were scared, quiet but responsive. Their eyes darted from the authorities to their parents and to the tree line with a certain type of frenzy. Every once in a while, they'd gather up the courage to take a glance at the 5th boy with nothing short of fear. They almost didn't even seem to recognize him. The 5th boy looked different from the others. He seemed distant. His eyes stared outward, focused on something 1,000 yards away in the darkness of the night. His mother would turn his head to face hers, yet his eyes remained fixated on whatever lurked in the shadows. His skin was cold and dry and his hair was disheveled. A blackish liquid had stained his lips and chin. Several large tears ran down his clothes as though they had been savagely clawed by some animal, yet his skin was strangely left undamaged. All the 5th boy would say was that he was tired and he wanted to go home. So his family went back to their house, and after some fruitless talks with the other children, the rest headed home as well. When the sun came up that next autumn day, the birds weren't the only things that chirped to life. That morning gave birth to the loudest song of all: police sirens. They echoed down the sparsely populated town for the second time in just as many days. Many other residents stepped outside to watch the unusual sight of both local and nearby law enforcement speeding down towards the boy's neighborhood. Later that day, the town would find out that the 5th boy had murdered his mother and ran off into the woods. His father had left for work only to discover that he had left his wallet at home. After a quick U-turn, he made it back to his home, and as soon as he entered, he knew something was off. He smelled death. In a blind rush, he ran to the home's kitchen to discover his son holding a kitchen knife. His mother was lying under him, blood bubbling out of the fresh wounds. 42 times, the boy had stabbed his mother. His boy looked at him and asked, "Dad, what have I done?" before running out of the back door of the kitchen with tears in his eyes. The father didn't chase him, he stayed with his wife until the police arrived. It didn't take long to find the man's son. About 100 yards into the tree line, the boy's body lay, tangled up in bushes and tree branches. The boy had stabbed himself in his abdomen for an unknown reason. With one hand, he clenched the knife, and with the other, he had strewn his inwards about. The responding officer said it looked like the boy was trying to get something out of him, or make space in his body for something else. Carved into a nearby tree were the words, "I'm so sorry, Dad. It's all over." The sheriff of the town and one of the 4 remaining boys' father immediately went home to talk to his child. He had a strong feeling that whatever happened the night before was the cause of this whole mess. For the longest time, the lifelong officer couldn't get anything out of his son. Not until he told him what had happened to his friend. Like a switch getting flipped on his son, he began talking. That boy's name was Sam. Sam, Ross, Jordan, Kane, and Tyler had been playing in the backyard of Sam's home while his father was away at work. Just behind the backyard lay miles upon miles of forest. Around mid-afternoon, the boys had thoughts about going home for the day. It was then a young girl adorned in a beautiful white dress stepped out of the woods. "You want to play with me?" she asked. Her tone was sweet and calm. The boys had never seen her anywhere else before. Sam spoke up first. "Sure, what do you want to play?" he asked, smiling at the pretty young girl. She flashed a pleased smile before spinning around and sprinting off into the woods. "Try and catch me," she hollered at the others. They were captivated by her and they didn't think twice about running into the woods to catch up to her. At this point, Sam broke down. His father waited until he could speak again to press for more details. The boys stated that they couldn't have been running for more than 10 minutes before they became lost. Somehow within those apparent few minutes of running, enough time had passed that the sun was already setting. The boys got scared and tried turning around, but no matter where they went, nothing seemed familiar to them. They felt as though the blackening woods were changing in front of their eyes. They wandered through dense forests in the pitch-colored night before stumbling upon a light in the distance. They walked towards it and discovered an old shack in the clearing. Lights and candles adored the outside of the building, spilling out a heatless path towards the door, and although frightened, they decided to walk up to the home and knock on the door. Sam explained how it creaked open on its own, exposing a one-room den. Bones of many different creatures hung from the ceiling, glistening a glossy white with the flickering of the fireplace off in the corner of the room. A large wooden table rested in the forefront of the room, and an old woman sat behind it, staring at the children with a toothless grin. Her blackened eyes somehow focused on each one of them. "Come in," the woman cooed. The children felt their feet move on their own, guiding them further inside the home without instruction. "I'm sorry to bother you, miss, but we want to go home and we're lost," Sam said. His voice trembled as the woman's head shifted unnaturally smoothly to face him. Her features were wooden and frozen. The only sign of life emanating off her was her cold but immensely intense eyes. They were the type of eyes that a child should have never seen. The eyes of a predator. "I can help you with that if you help me with something," the old lady croaked. "Please have a seat." Her arms stretched the length of double their height as they winged themselves over the table. Large sacks of thick, grizzly fat dangled under her forearms and biceps as she gestured to the 5 empty seats around the table. Her arms, though grotesquely misshapen, had the same wooden quality as her face. The fat seemed hard and bony, almost petrified with age. The children felt the same force that made them enter push them towards their seats. They pulled the unusually heavy wooden chairs away from the table and took their spots. The woman's crooked arms folded themselves downward, draping themselves under the table before producing a wooden box, latched with an old iron lock. She placed it in front of the boys. "Before I ask for my bargain, would any of you children like anything?" Her smile didn't falter, nor did it move in the slightest way when she spoke. Her jaw merely would drop down and snap shut. Her thinning hair plumed off her head like a mane, not reacting at all to the odd, rapid movements of her head and mouth. The children looked at each other and shook their heads. Each of their eyes begged for someone to take the lead, to run away, but no one did. It felt like their legs were useless under their small frames. "Good, then let me begin." Her head and lips chattered like hardened bone with every word that flew out of her mouth. She used her long, spindly fingers to shift the box to face the children. Like her eyes, her fingers were full of life and agility. They moved with unnatural expertise and grace. "I have 4 gifts in this chest for you, and 1 gift for me." She let the words hang in the air. The young minds of the boys tried to wrap their heads around her sentence. "But there are 5 of us," Ross whispered towards the woman. She twisted her head like a hawk towards him, her eyes like daggers. "And only 4 of you will be going home." She gave a chuckle and let the children take in what she had just said. The boys sat in silence, letting the noises of the crackling fire from the candles and fireplace take over the room. Each child could very clearly hear their own heartbeat thudding desperately in their chest. Each wanted to run, but none could. With a few taps from her pointed fingertips, the box opened. Hay lined the bottom of the wooden chest and 5 items lay on top. The first was the head of an old doll. Its eyelids flickered to life rapidly before resting in the open position, gazing lifelessly towards the ceiling. The next was a penny, damaged on one side but common enough looking. Thirdly, there was a large black button. Nothing seemed special about it other than the fact that candlelight flickered across it with unusual clarity. Next to that was a simple piece of candy, some sort of chocolate wrapped in a white cloth. And finally was a brightly colored yellow dandelion. It was freshly picked. "Please, each of you take one. No need to spoil the surprise." Her neck craned itself towards the leader of the boys, Sam, who returned a look of pure hatred towards the woman. Without hesitation, he grabbed the head of the doll, sure that he would be the one that was cursed with stain. The other boys watched as the doll's eyes rolled back in its socket. A little girl's giggle echoed in the old woman's den. Sally always likes to play. She'll do anything to keep her playmates safe and well fed. A cackle called out of her stiff mouth. Next up was Ross. He took the piece of candy and looked up towards the ancient woman across the table from him. Enjoy the sweet, my dear. I'm sure there'll be more in the future. Her eyes shifted towards the next boy. Tyler took the black button. It was the size of a $50 and it fit snugly in the boy's palm. An eye for an eye, my child. The boy looked down at his new black trinket and gasped as he saw his own reflection. He could feel a gaze resting on him, emanated from the button. The next child, Kane, took the penny. It remained an unremarkable piece of metal. Interesting. The final boy, Jordan, was left with the dandelion. As soon as he picked it up, the old lady's head snapped over to face him. And I have my reward right here. The woman rose up from the table. Her body stretched itself lengthwise towards the ceiling. She had an unnaturally lanky body. Her bones were seeming frail and fragile under the near see-through black fabric that draped over her slender frame. The rest of you may leave. Follow the path right back home. Her hands reached forward and cradled Jordan's face. A tear trickled down his cheek. The remaining children stood up, legs shaking from underneath them. One by one they left until it was just their leader, Sam, and the final boy. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Sam said towards the last boy. But his apology wasn't directed at Jordan. No, it was directed at the 3 children outside the home. With a quick toss, he threw the doll's head towards the last boy, who caught it in his grip. Immediately, the sounds of an angry child erupted in the den. The old woman's smile remained, but the joy in her eyes had left. The hair on the back of her head stood on end in a panic. Run! Sam yelled at Jordan, and Jordan quickly stood up and ran out of the door, joining the rest of the boys in their flee away from the den. They followed the dirt path, hearing the sounds of the high-pitched screaming coming from the home. Eventually, as the sound subsided, the only sounds they heard was the exasperated tones of their breaths as their energy began to leave them. The children had ran for a handful of minutes past their limits, exhausted but unwilling to rest in the darkness of this foreign forest. It was then, at their most tired, that a flutter came from above them. A black shape quickly darted down from the darkened skies onto the path ahead of them. A large, black shape stood between them and their homes. With a hunchback and grim expression, they saw the old lady unravel herself from her cloak, her pale, white face being the only contrast to the blackness around them. Her head had seemingly fallen into despair. Flaps of skin clung off her bony face like drapery. Her lips had disappeared in favor of a mouth that stretched from one end of her jaw to the other, splitting her head in half. The children stopped dead in their tracks to stare at this monster. The crooked woman stutter-stepped her way towards them, each movement jagged and harsh. Her knees had bent themselves at a 90-degree angle to support her deranged, angular body. "How dare you!" she screeched. "I only wanted you." She pointed out one of her long fingers towards the last boy in line. Jordan froze, whether it be from fear or some unnatural force. He stopped dead in his tracks. The other children backed away from him in silent terror as the hunchback lady in black lurched herself towards him. As soon as he was within the woman's arm reach, she silently leaped off the dirt and engulfed the child into the inkiness of her body. He fell to the dirt screaming. The boys watched for only a moment as the old lady opened her mouth like a lid of a can. Black ooze began spilling from the woman's gaping hole and into the boy's lungs. The rest of the boys abandoned him there to the sounds of his drowning. They left him alone to deal with whatever creature they had found that night. The boys eventually ran back into town, right where their journey began. This is where they were surprised to see that not just the 4 of them had made it back, but all 5. At some point in their journey, Jordan had caught back up with them. Sam swore he only heard the 4 sets of footsteps in the darkness of that path. He had never heard Jordan's. Sam's father had had enough of the story. He could see it on his son's face that something had happened out there, but he wasn't going to believe a story like that. Him and his force devised a detailed search of the area looking for anything out of the ordinary. They never found a path or a cabin or a missing girl. After months passed and nothing happened, they dropped the case. Years later, and Sam turned to drinking at a young age. Tyler moved off into the farmland far away from the forest and Kane went to the city. and I stayed here. My name's Ross, and I saw everything.